Right, so let's just look at what are the different layers of a Spring Boot application, right, at a very high level, because these will then define the different annotations that we will use to tell Spring Boot the type of file it is or which layer it belongs to, right? So basically, we will, for simplicity, consider three application layers within a Spring Boot application, right? The first is, as we have already seen, the controller layer, right? This is basically going to define all the REST endpoints that that Spring Boot application exposes, right? And when I say a REST endpoint, it basically is a contract between the client and the service, right? Like what will be the URI of the REST endpoint that the microservice is exposing, right? We've seen one which had something like slash v1 slash hello from the previous videos. It might also define what will be the request, right? And we'll see what is a request and what is a response. But in general, right, any API would take some inputs as a request, right? Do some bit of processing on that request parameters or request body, and then send back a response to the client, right? And in this response types could be an XML or a JSON or any other format, right, that we will look at a later point in time. But basically, a REST endpoint is a contract between a client and a service, right? So all the REST endpoints or all such contracts that this microservice exposes will reside in the controller layer, right? The controller layer does not carry any business logic. It's very important that it should only have these contracts defined, right? Now, in the contract, we can also consider not just the success scenario, but also the failure scenarios. So if, let's say, the request does not carry one of the very mandatory attributes, right? In that case, while processing, the service layer might actually fail, right? It might fail to process that particular request. So in that case, the response will not be a success. It will be a failure response that we need to send back. And we'll look at some of the HTTP codes which signify that the request had failed at the service, right? We'll look at them at a later point as well. But that's the controller layer for you, right? When the request is received by the controller layer, it will simply pass it over to the service layer for processing. This is where most of your business logic is going to sit in, right? Whatever business logic needs to be processed or run on top of that input will all have to be written in the service layer, right? And as a result of that processing, whatever is the output of that processing, it might have to be saved in a database, it might have to be passed over to another microservice, or it might just have to be passed back to the client service, right? It's possible that either of these three or a combination of the three scenarios might happen. So in which case all this business logic will stay in the service layer, right? And the last and final layer that we will look at for the purpose of these annotation videos is the repository layer, right? Now, whenever a microservice has to talk to any data store, any persistent data store, it will do it via the repository layer, right? So the service layer, post completing all the processing, will pass over this data to the repository layer, right? And the repository layer will then save this data to the database that has been configured in the microservice, right? So this way, a Spring Boot microservice keeps these three layers in a way decoupled from each other, right? So tomorrow, if let's say you want to change your database from MySQL to Oracle, for example, you don't have to change the controller layer or the service layer at all. You just have to go and change the repository layer, right? So that keeps these three layers decoupled from each other. Similarly, if let's say you want to modify the contract a little bit, right? You probably created a new version of an endpoint, but the underlying business logic still remains the same. There is no change in the service layer. In that case, you just have to change the controller layer, right? And then call the same service function, and it will do the same processing, and if required, save the database, save the record in the same database. Right, so I hope this sort of gives you an idea of the different layers inside a Spring Boot application that we have at a high level. And with that, I think let's dig into the annotations.